Hi, welcome to Blogging Heads TV. You're watching Culturally Determined, and I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade. And my guest today is David Litt. David, could you introduce yourself?
Absolutely. So in addition to having worked with you on a humor magazine all the way back in college, wrote speeches for President Obama from 2011 to 2016. I did a lot of stuff, but I probably specialized in the jokes and the correspondence dinners he would do every year. And I just wrote a book called Thanks Obama, My Hopey, Changey White House Years. And thank you for plugging it right now. And so
Yeah.
I hope everyone watches, they see the book cover and immediately say, well, I will read that book because Aryeh is holding up the book cover very close to the camera, and now I have no choice but to go buy it.
Yeah, it's a very enjoyable book. One thing I did want to point out, you're the first person I've ever known to have a selfie as their author photo, which I think is an
Yeah,
innovation.
well, I think in many ways it's a book about how I've managed to do some really exciting jobs, but have still a slight amount of incompetence at certain things related to those jobs. It was not intentional to have a selfie, but I think that's sort of in keeping with a lot of the other things that I did while I was writing speeches for Obama.
Yeah, so as you mentioned before, we knew each other a little bit in college, working on the Yale Record Humor magazine. And could you lay out your path from humble college humor writer to, Oval Office meeting attendee and writer of speeches for Barack Obama?
I was a senior in college in '08, and I had done the humor magazine that we've talked about. I was doing improv comedy with the Yale Exit Players improv comedy troupe. I interned at the Onion the summer before I graduated, and I thought I wanted to go into writing for the Onion or someplace like that. And then it turned out I wasn't very good at it, particularly headlines. That's just, as you know, a very specific style of humor writing, and I was not great at that. So I was casting about for something else to do. I applied to join the CIA. That didn't work because I had smoked weed within a calendar year of my interview. And I was really unsure. And then I saw Barack Obama speak on January 3rd, 2008. I was watching a free in-flight cable on a plane, and CNN was on. And President Obama, then candidate Obama, delivered this speech after winning the Iowa caucuses. And it was one of those very rare moments when you can tell for sure that your life is changing. Like, I started watching that speech, and then by the time the plane landed, I was a different person. I was like, okay, whatever Obama's doing, I want to find out how to be part of that. So I worked in Ohio as a field organizer first. I didn't think I was going to be a speechwriter. And then I moved to DC, was probably the world's worst intern for a little while, which I get into in the book. We can talk about it now if you want. And then really fell into speechwriting and from there into a White House job. So I'd like to think there was some talent involved, but I also thought it was important to acknowledge that luck played a pretty big role in getting a job like that, especially pretty young.
Um, what do you think that? So you initially were a volunteer with the campaign and then worked for the campaign. Did having a humor background translate in any way to that particular role?
It did in two ways. So one thing that I remember a former boss of mine telling me, he was a Bill Clinton speechwriter at this firm I worked at called West Wing Writers. And he used to say that he always felt he could write a good Bill Clinton speech because he knew how to write a parody of a Bill Clinton speech. He had also come from humor writing. And that is true. I mean, if you write a parody of somebody and you dial it back by about 20%, you've then written a speech for that person. The other thing that was helpful is in White House speechwriting, like in any job, especially in any competitive job, it sort of helps to have a niche. And there are a lot of people who are great speechwriters in DC, but there are fewer of them who can also write jokes when the need arises. And so the fact that I showed up with some joke writing experience under my belt meant that when John Lovett, who was the speechwriter in charge of jokes before me, when he left to go to Hollywood, there was suddenly a sort of need for a funny guy, and I, by default, was the token funny person.
So you wrote for the White House Correspondents' Dinner. There's a couple ones that are noteworthy, but the first one I want to ask you about is the one at which the Bin Laden raid was happening, unbeknownst to everyone else in the world, and was also the event that possibly spurred Donald Trump to run for president. Can you talk a little bit about that Correspondence
Yeah.
Dinner?
So that was, like you said, 2011. I had just started at the White House, so I was not running the joke writing process that year by any means. I was basically pitching jokes, and I could see drafts as they came in. So I had a couple of jokes in that year's script, which was being managed by Jon Favreau and John Lovett and David Axelrod. And one of the jokes actually had Bin Laden as a punchline. The joke was about Tim Pawlenty, who was running for president in 2012 as a Republican, and it was, Tim Pawlenty sounds all American, but have you heard his real middle name? It's Tim Bin Laden Pawlenty. So I thought this is a really good joke. Bin Laden, in addition to being kind of edgy, just has a good sound for a joke. You've got the rhyme on either side. You have the hard D sound in the middle. And I was very happy about this joke. And then the people running the process that year went into the Oval Office with the president, and I saw the draft that came back, and Bin Laden was missing. They had changed it to Hosni, which was the name of the Egyptian strongman who got deposed in the Arab Spring. And Hosni is not a funny word, and also he's not nearly as edgy. I was very annoyed about this joke, and I almost wrote an email. I mean, I pulled out my BlackBerry and I started typing furiously and had a manifesto totally ready to go. And then the way I put it in the book, it was like a little bureaucratic angel was just sitting on my shoulder, like just reminding me, stay in your lane. And so I listened to the angel, and I put down the BlackBerry, and I went to the dinner. And the next day, when the rest of the world, including me, found out about the Bin Laden raid, I was suddenly really glad I had not hit send on that email. And it was, I think in a way, I mean, that moment was one of many times along the way at the White House where I sort of realized, like, even when you're doing a small thing, it's not a small thing. Even when you're just writing a punchline for a joke that's one of 30 jokes that's going to be in the script, it can have much bigger implications than you realize. So, I'm glad I learned that one the easy way.
So I remember watching that, and I remember thinking, and Obama told some really, really good Trump jokes, and Trump was in the audience. And one of the jokes was something like, Trump was mulling whether to run for president, and Obama mocked him by having to make the big decisions about whether, Penn Jillette or, C-list Hollywood star, I can't remember, was going to be fired in that week on The Apprentice, and the cameras cut to Trump, and he's kind of like, looks pissed off. And I remember thinking at the time, like, okay, they're like, Obama just blew up Trump, like, Trump is over, like, he's done. He's been shown to be, like, the carnival-esque fool that he is. And yet he managed to come back, as we all know. I mean, what did you think about that as, like Obama, like, setting out a comedic insult, and just possibly, like, the resentment from this sparking Trump's desire to actually run for president?
I don't think it sparked Trump's desire to run for president. I mean, he'd been talking about running for president for over a decade, and he had just been on this kind of birther revival tour, right, where he started getting all this attention from Fox News and the conservative media by saying Obama was born in Kenya. And so I think he was well on board the politics train. And that's one of the reasons that President Obama made fun of him, was that he had kind of put himself in the arena in that way, even though he was sort of a dangerous buffoon even then. And the president, I do think that the moment that Trump saw those remarks, saw those jokes, it wasn't so much resentment. In my theory, I feel like psychoanalyzing Donald Trump is kind of like everybody's second job these days, or at least everybody's hobby. But my version of it is that Trump wasn't so much angry, he was jealous. Because I think Trump has always wanted the love of Hollywood elites. He's wanted Washington journalists to love him. He's wanted politicians to love him. And that's the audience in the Correspondence Center. And all these people were united in their appreciation for the president and laughing at one of the president's political opponents. And that's like catnip for Donald Trump. So in my mind, he thought, ooh, if I was the guy who was behind that podium, everyone would love me like that, which of course is not how being president works. And I think there's an irony in the fact that he had to skip this year's Correspondence Dinner because it would have gone so badly. But I do think I did have the same moment that you described. I write in my book about having that, like, oh, that's the end of Donald Trump feeling. And I think I heard him described recently as Trump, as some of his qualities are impressive, even if they're not admirable. And I thought that was a good description. I think one of those impressive but not admirable qualities is he has an ability to just power through. And also, he has very astute political instincts for his base. And I think he realized that while the sort of elites were in that room were going to dismiss him, there were people who weren't going to give up on him just because he said something that was outrageous and racist and wildly incorrect. And in fact, that would endear him to certain people. And so I think that I don't know that he strategized all this at the time, but I do think he had some instinct that said, hey, my political ambitions here are not done. And I think that particularly became true in 2012 after Romney lost.
Yeah, I think Ezra Klein has written about how Trump doesn't have has a total lack of shame and
Yeah.
normal, mores and guidelines of human behavior just don't apply to him at all, and kind of the norms that have built up around the presidency, he just obliterates them. So it is impressive how little shame he manages to have. So sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say something that's interesting in addition to that. I agree that he is a totally shameless person. What we mean by that is somebody who is only slightly ashamed. And I think he does not have the shame gene. But I think that the other thing that he's been very good at is figuring out that there is a type of shamelessness that then will appeal to elements of his base. That, that this kind of display, because it will make certain people so upset, will make other people sort of reactively say, oh, people I don't like are getting all, the sort of liberal tears argument of governance that we have right now. Like, these people I disdain hate Trump because he's being a ridiculous, terrible person. Well, then Trump must be on my side. And I think he picked up on that. Again, I don't know that he figured it out in his head, but I think something about he sensed it somehow. And I think he's, clearly done well with that theory.
Yeah, I think one of his, I don't really know how politically smart he is, but I do think he does have a very good sense of playing on people's resentment, and like whipping up the NFL protest issue has probably been a political benefit for him, and he does seem to have a pro-national talent for whipping up these kind of economic and racial resentments.
Yeah. Well, and some of it too is I always think about the combination of the person and the moment. So I think part of what made President Obama so inspiring to people like me in 2008 was not just who he was, but the moment that he was running in. And I think for Trump, it was a moment when a minority of Americans, but a significant minority, had this combination that he has of sort of more power than they realize, but also a huge amount of resentment. And I think that combination turned out to be more potent than, it still wasn't enough to win him a majority of votes in either the primary or the general election, but it was enough to get him close that then sort of structural issues got him over the hump.
So you mentioned that he skipped the White House Correspondents' Dinner, which has become a ritual. Do you know, how far back does that go? When did presidents start regularly attending that?
This was not a research-heavy book, but I did research this question, and now I don't remember what the answer was. I think it was Calvin Coolidge was the first president to do the dinner, but he wasn't joking around. It was very I don't know, it was sort of just describing the importance of the press and sort of a nice thing to do for the press corps. And then, again, if I remember this correctly, if you look at most of the jokes through at least Reagan, they were not broad. They were very, very specific to the press. So Gerald Ford joked about Aldo Beckman and his swizzle stick, which I just remember reading that. I don't know what that means. I know Aldo Beckman was a White House reporter, but I don't know what swizzle stick he was referring to. And certainly nobody who watched, a tape of this would have any idea unless they were part of this little clubby world. During the Reagan years, they brought, I'm blanking on the name, but it was the woman who Gary Hart had an affair with.
Mm-hmm.
She was invited to the dinner. And then that kind of opened the floodgates to celebrities. And then, Anne Hesh and Ellen DeGeneres came in, I think, maybe it was the 90s, or I'm losing track of it. This is why I wrote it all down. But Ozzy Osbourne and Sharon Osbourne. Sharon Osbourne. Yeah, see, this is anyway. So as you can see, I'm running out of details I remember, but including the names of famous people. But basically, more and more famous people started showing up, and so by the time Obama became president, I think partly because he was such an attractive figure to so many people in Hollywood, and also because this had been the trend for decades, it became this kind of weird bilateral summit between Washington and L.A.
Yeah, and it became known as the Nerd Prom. What did you make of the fact that Trump broke at least modern, contemporary precedent by not showing up? What do you think that says about him?
Well, I don't think that the problem is that it was a bad decision. I think the problem is that he is a bad person, and that's reflected in the decisions that he makes. So what I mean by that is it would not have been very hard. I think the standards would have been set extraordinarily low, actually, if Trump had showed up, said a few self-deprecating things, sort of made fun of the fact that he had just called journalists the enemies of the enemy of the people, or the enemies of the people, and called it a night, and laughed politely while Hassan Minhaj told his jokes. He would have gotten a ton of credit for that, and that shouldn't be that difficult to do. And I think the fact that he was able to do none of those things says something about the kind of person he is. I think it also says something about the kind of person he is, that he's not capable of delivering a self-deprecating joke, sort of acknowledging that while my job may be important, like I personally am not sacred. I don't think Trump draws a distinction between the United States and Donald Trump personally. And often when he does see national issues, he sees them in terms of how they affect Trump. I mean, that's how, when he talks about Puerto Rico relief, he's basically talking about, like, what have people said about me? Are they giving me enough credit? And so I think those things are reflected in that kind of decision-making and his lack of ability to tell a joke, as most of us would sort of define that word.
Yeah, and I mean, he in the late '90s, there's like a parallel tradition in New York City of New York City government hosting a kind of annual roast event, and he did a tape skit with Rudy Giuliani, in which Giuliani was in drag, and he kissed Giuliani. Are you aware of this?
I vaguely remember this. I don't. Keep going.
Well, it's very strange. We can hunt down a YouTube link and include it below. Giuliani had a couple instances of wearing drag at this one specific event, which is maybe called the Gridiron Dinner, but maybe that's something else.
No, the Gridiron is a DC thing.
Okay, yeah, this is like a New York City
I know what you're
thing.
Talking about. I don't remember the name of it, but yeah, it's this weird New York similar tradition.
So I think, I mean, one of my personal Trump theories is that he's like in the early stages of Alzheimer's or some form of cognitive decline. So I think, like, at one point in his life, he saw himself as capable of engaging in like regular jokes and being a figure of fun, and he's like lost that aspect of his personality and can no longer tell a joke about himself.
Well, that's interesting. But I also do wonder. I mean, the joke there wasn't really on him, and I think that's his obligation was not to tell a self-deprecating joke. In that moment, it was kind of like, because it's the same thing. He's always been comfortable with people kind of joking about his hair, right?
Right.
When he did that Comedy Central roast, he had basically said hair is fair game, but joking about whether or not I actually have as much money as I say I do is off limits. So I think he's found ways, not unlike other politicians, but just much more narrowly construed and much more dangerous when it comes to his ego, to think about, okay, here's the things we joke about, but here's the things that are off limits. It's just that so much of it is anything real is off limits to him.
So you wrote jokes for Obama. How would you characterize Obama's sense of humor?
Well, I think the sense of humor that I saw for the most part was like the official sense of humor. So we'd be going over jokes, and I had a sense of what he would think is funny, what he wouldn't. When he was delivering a joke, I think the thing that most people remarked on, which is totally true, is that he had, as president, really good timing. I think I've written jokes for other politicians, and it's pretty rare that you have a politician who can hold a pause for the exact right length of time before delivering a punchline, because that requires a sort of real subtle sense of audience that most politicians don't have. They're not performers in that way. So I think that was one of the things I always appreciated about President Obama. Another thing that I always thought about was he understood that joke writing needs to be really precise. Like in a speech, the difference between a good line and a great line is real but not substantial. in a joke, the difference between good and great is the difference between life and death. I mean, the joke is either funny or it's not. And so he would make handwritten edits, especially at the very last day before the dinner, that would often replace, but, comma, with however, comma, or whatever small change. But the difference would be really noticeable. And so the fact that he had that ear for the language and then also for the audience response made writing jokes for him a lot easier than it would have been for writing for other politicians.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I thought was noteworthy about Obama was that he never became he was such a hard target to do satire about. He wasn't a figure of fun in the way that Bill Clinton and George W. Bush and Donald Trump are figures of fun. And there was never like an easy joke you could tell about Obama. I think because he's like came across as a real person and a substantial person and not like a cartoon figure like so many of these modern political figures come across as. Do you think like was there anyone you thought had like a good joke on Obama?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I'm a little biased here because I do think that one of the reasons he was hard to satirize is that he was a very consistent, a lot of the time you're satirizing politicians for being hypocrites or for presenting themselves one way to the world and acting a different way. And I think the reason he was hard to satirize for that is that he didn't do a lot of that. I mean, for the most part, what you saw, what you see is what you get. I'm thinking about like Luther, the anger translator, the Keegan-Michael Key character, as a funny way of approaching Obama comedically because it was getting at, in a sense, a way that he had to be different in public than you would expect him to be in private or than you or I would be if the same thing was happening to us. This idea that like Obama needed this outlet for his anger and, would have somebody translate for that is a way of getting at there it's not so much kind of a contradiction, but it's this gulf between a public persona and what you would expect from a private person in the same situation. I'm thinking about, for me, whenever I wrote a speech and it would end up getting made fun of on The Daily Show, it was like this kind of mix. On one hand, I'd feel a little embarrassed. On the other hand, I'd be like, this is so cool. Like my thing made The Daily Show, even though it obviously didn't make it for like good reasons, just to see it on there. So there were times for sure when we got made fun of for something that, to be fair, like we deserved. I don't know that it was necessarily the president who was the butt of the joke. Like the very first speech I ever wrote for him was actually in Puerto Rico. He delivered 5 minutes sort of standing on the tarmac just about Puerto Rico's place in American life and American culture, a little bit about statehood and the question of statehood. And I used every possible Puerto Rico reference I could think of, like basketball players and food and dancing and everything you possibly could. And The Daily Show went through all of those references to kind of make fun of just how many Puerto Rico specific things were in the speech. So there was kind of piecemeal stuff, but it wasn't a big. It was hard to get. This was This was an incredibly long answer. While anyone watching just heard me think out loud for like 5 minutes. But the conclusion of all of it is, I think it was hard to figure out who he was as a character that was different than the person you saw when he was in front of the cameras as president. I think that was a challenge in a way it probably wasn't for Clinton, where the kind of SNL version of Clinton presented itself obviously. The SNL version of Trump or Bush present themselves obviously.
Yeah, so I do think that the Luther the Anger Translator was the best Obama-centric item of humor from his presidency, and you helped engineer a collision between satire and reality of getting Keegan-Michael Key to do the Anger Translator bit at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. So how do you view that with the benefit of hindsight?
Fondly. So just to be fair, President Obama was always a fan of Key and Peele. He had met them before, and he was. We had always sort of thought, like, is this the year we try to get Luther, the Anger Translator, on stage with President Obama in real life? And year after year, it just was never the right year for various reasons. In 2012, with an election coming up, we didn't want to imply that President Obama was secretly an angry black man. That seemed like a poor political choice. 2013, there had just been the bombing at the Boston Marathon, so we were going to be more subdued. In 2014, healthcare.gov had just launched, and so that didn't go great, so we had to be a little humble. 2015, it just seemed like the right year. We were kind of on a tear anyway, and it was the give no fucks Obama, that time. And I had met Keegan at a holiday party, and I just kind of emailed him and said, like, hey, could you last minute drop everything and come do this? And he was like, yeah, I can do it. So, we put together the script. What was fun for me and what I write about in the book was being in the rehearsal room, in the map room of the White House, and watching President Obama try and utterly fail to keep a straight face while Keegan was talking. Because every time Keegan said anything, President Obama would just lose it. And in the actual performance, I didn't think he was going to be able to hold it together the whole time, but he was able to do it, which is fairly impressive.
So another comedic moment that you helped engineer was the Between Two Ferns interview with Zach Galifianakis, which included one of the best jokes, I think, which is Galifianakis asking Obama, how does it feel to be the last black president? And this was like a screaming success, and we'll link to it if people never saw it during the time. How did that come together?
Well, in my book, I make it very clear that I thought that was going to be a terrible idea. So I was not the one saying we have to bring in Zach Galifianakis in Between Two Ferns. I was the one who was not important enough to be asked their opinion, but was quietly thinking this will be a disaster. And then I was totally wrong. So I'm glad no one asked for my opinion, because I would have given a bad one. So it came about where Funny or Die, which is where I work now, but at the time was sort of an outside group, they began meeting with the White House, basically saying, we know this Obamacare enrollment thing is coming up. You've got some, things you want to try in the second term. We just want to be part of something. We're here if you need us. And we said, that's interesting, but I don't think anyone took it that seriously. And then in 2014 or 2013, the healthcare site launched. At first, it worked absolutely terribly. And young people, even into 2014, weren't signing up. And so we needed some way to reach them, and we were having trouble doing it in any of the conventional ways. And we, for a variety of reasons, it just seemed like the right thing to do was throw a Hail Mary. And the Hail Mary was bring in Zach Galifianakis and have him record this thing with the president. And part of that was that the president was willing to do jokes like, how does it feel to be the last black president? They were, and I didn't write jokes for that. I did a little bit of annoying policy detail, but that was it. But the people who were writing jokes for that script, basically, they have always felt that to be funny, they have to be able to be true to that character in that show. So I think the White House, when I was there and when they were thinking about Between Two Ferns, they were willing to approach this as saying, okay, we're going to kind of step into your house a little bit, and we'll be part of your show. We'll be part of the world of your show, rather than demanding absolute control. And I think that's one of the reasons it was so successful.
So moving forward to our current dystopia, you work at Funny or Die in the DC office. How have you approached making fun of Trump?
Well, I think the hard thing is that everything going on is simultaneously so absurd and sometimes so stupid that it's hard to make fun of. I mean, so for example, Trump challenging his Secretary of State to an IQ test is both already incredibly exaggerated, but it also is a distraction from much more important things. So the question is always, how do we provide an angle on it that is not obvious? And also, how can we tie it back to stuff that matters, if at all possible? So an example would be like during the healthcare debate over repeal in the summer, we knew that because we have a DC office and we could talk to people who've done polling, we knew that we could approach this as the challenge is the secrecy around the process, not the specifics of what's in the bill, but the fact that no one knows what's in the bill. So we could do a video about that. And that we did a gender reveal party for the Republican healthcare bill that did pretty well online. And that kind of thing, I think, is when we're doing something valuable. Sometimes it's very hard because the cycle has shrunk. In the same way the news cycle shrunk, sort of the cycle to make fun of things has shrunk too.
One thing that I think is noteworthy about the Trump administration is how many potential targets of satire there are. Like, no one really remembers who Obama's press secretaries were, and they didn't receive specific parodies on Saturday Night Live, whereas Sean Spicer became a household name, and Melissa McCarthy won an Emmy for making fun of him. Do you have any theories about why there's such a wide array of targets?
Yeah, I mean, I think the gosh, that's a good question. I think we're just so glued to the political process in general that we're discovering all these people who we didn't otherwise know existed. I think sometimes partly because of shows like Veep, there's an interest in the staff, not just in the president. And I also think that you have people who, traditionally the goal has been for staffers to be behind the scenes, but I think you have staff who, because they're undisciplined, are becoming famous in their own right. And I think that all flows from the fact that Trump himself is undisciplined, that you have people kind of going off the reservation and doing weird stuff. But you also have staff who are very important, like Stephen Miller, Trump's chief speechwriter, but also I think sort of currently the core of the white nationalist faction in the Trump White House. And he is not an SNL character because I think he's savvy enough to know that in Trump world, you ultimately don't want to become famous because Trump feels threatened by that.
Right. Although he did once take the lectern in the at a press briefing and started mixed it up with the press corps.
He's done that, but he's been very good at immediately going back and sort of saying Donald Trump is the most impressive person who's ever walked the earth or whatever, to make it clear that he's only doing this in service to gratifying his boss and glorifying his boss. In a way you shouldn't have to in politics normally. Like your president should not be that insecure, but that's where we're at.
Do you have any opinion on like how the White House, like the office of the White House, is misfunctioning based on your own experience working there? Like it just seems like a madhouse, and it seems to come from the top because Trump, is totally undisciplined, and the adult daycare thing seems to be true. But like what is your sense of like how things are actually going there based on once working there?
I mean, I think my sense is probably about that generally what you're seeing, the sort of chaos that you're seeing in the news, is probably reflective of the chaos that's actually existing there. It's not that easy to hide everything that's going on, especially in a culture where people are leaking all the time. So, my sense is also it is very hard for any political organization not to become a reflection of the person who leads it. And so whatever is going on in Donald Trump's head, which is kind of warped and chaotic and stunted in strange ways, is going to be reflected in his White House, no matter how hard they work to keep that from happening. And I'm not even sure they're working that hard to keep that from happening. I think some people encourage it. So I think the interesting thing is also not just what's happening in the White House, but everything that's happening tangential to the White House. Because the White House is so crazy, it's letting a lot of other more serious stuff just sort of slide under the radar. I mean, today we found out that Mitch McConnell is trying to get rid of blue slips, which is a procedural thing, but it basically means it would be easier to pack the appeals courts with extremely far radical right-wing judges. And that's a huge unprecedented step. I mean, that's several days of news in a normal environment, and it's about 15 minutes now. And I don't have a solution for that, but I do think it's a really big problem.
Who do you think has done a really good job of like nailing Trump in terms of comedy? I think that the SNL has not done a great job, and the Baldwin impression is I'm kind of lukewarm on it. What do you think?
I like Alec Baldwin's impression. I think everybody's doing it differently. I mean, I think some of the people who've done it best, like, I think Jimmy Kimmel has done a really good job. As I know that's not an original answer, but I think that it's people sort of telling jokes, but being willing to be serious at key points. I think Colbert's done a good job. I think what's been interesting is to see different people take different angles on it and sort of speak to the Trump era in their own voice. So I'm not sure that there's kind of going to be one comedian who takes down Trump. I don't think any comedian is going to take down Trump, but I think they'll each take on this in a slightly different way.
Um, I think that's all the questions I have. So,
Okay.
thanks, Obama, which is a great title, by the way.
I, I didn't like that title initially, and my publisher was like, "You really need to go with that. It makes much more sense." And they were totally correct. I mean, I wanted a very pretentious authory title, and I'm glad that I went with theirs.
So, thanks, Obama, my Hopey, Changey White House Years by David Litt. Check it out. It's both an enjoyable memoir and a humorous memoir, and kind of shows you what it's like to actually work in the most important office in the country. So, David, thanks a lot for coming on. Thanks to all of our viewers and listeners out there, and we'll see you again next time.
Thanks so much.